The Gene Kelly house in Beverly Hills is a charming mid-century home tucked into a quiet, tree-lined street. Built during Hollywood's golden age, it once belonged to the legendary dancer and actor Gene Kelly. While the house has changed hands over the decades, its legacy remains alive, sometimes in more ways than one. Several years ago, the home's current owner, Laura Mitchell, moved in with her young daughter, Chloe. On the first evening after they settled in, Laura noticed an odd sensation in the living room. It wasn't just the grandeur of the space that caught her attention, it was a faint, rhythmic tremor in the air, as though the room itself were gently exhaling. Brushing it off as a draft, Laura went about her evening, but Chloe was less dismissive. "Mom," she whispered later that night, clutching her blanket, "I heard someone tapping their feet." Laura smiled and assured Chloe it was just the old house settling. But the sound returned night after night. A soft, measured cadence echoed faintly, in perfect time with the music Laura sometimes played while unpacking. It wasn't just Laura and Chloe who noticed. Friends who came over for dinner reported a peculiar feeling in the living room, a lightness in the air as though someone were moving gracefully past them. At first, Laura laughed off their remarks. "It's probably just the house showing its age," she joked. But as weeks turned into months, the oddities continued. One evening, Laura hosted a small gathering. A record of old jazz classics played softly on the turntable, filling the room with nostalgia. Amid the music, a faint but unmistakable rhythm began, footsteps that danced in sync with the melody. Guests froze, their chatter dying away as they listened, wide-eyed. The footsteps carried on for several seconds before fading into silence. "That's Gene," one guest finally said, his voice trembling. "It has to be." Intrigued, Laura dove into the home's history. She learned that Gene Kelly had not only lived there but often rehearsed in the living room, transforming it into a personal studio. The house had borne witness to countless hours of his dancing, his laughter, and his unparalleled creativity. While some might find such experiences unsettling, Laura and Chloe came to embrace them. Chloe began leaving an open space in the living room when she practiced her ballet routines, joking that Mr. Gene might need the room. And Laura often played Kelly's favorite jazz records, feeling as though the house came alive in those moments, a tribute to its former owner. To this day, visitors to the Gene Kelly house report a light, otherworldly presence in the living room, as if an invisible dancer still calls it home. Perhaps it's the spirit of Gene Kelly himself, forever lost in the magic of music and motion. Or maybe it's the echoes of a life so vibrant, it refuses to fade away. One chilly autumn evening, Laura decided to document the peculiar happenings in her journal. She set up her phone to record as she wrote, hoping to capture any unusual sounds. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the wind outside. She wrote about the footsteps, the tremors, and the occasional feeling of being watched, not in a menacing way, but as if someone were curiously observing her from a distance. Hours later, when she reviewed the recording, her heart skipped a beat. At the 10-minute mark, just after the sound of her pen scratching on paper, there was a faint noise. It wasn't the wind or a creak in the floorboards, it was humming. A low, melodic hum, carrying the tune of an old classic she couldn't quite place. The sound grew clearer for several seconds before it stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had been producing it suddenly realized they were being recorded. Shaken but curious, Laura decided to dig deeper. She searched the archives for anything about the house's history, finding old photos of Kelly rehearsing in the living room. One image caught her attention. It was a black-and-white photograph of Gene Kelly mid-spin, his arms outstretched and an expression of pure joy on his face. Behind him, reflected faintly in the polished floorboards, was a shadow, one that didn't match his stance. That same night, as she prepared for bed, Chloe came running into her room, her eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. "Mom, he was here!" she exclaimed. Laura sat up straight. "Who, sweetheart?" "The dancing man," Chloe said breathlessly. "I saw him in the living room. He smiled at me, but when I tried to talk to him, he just disappeared." Laura's pulse quickened. Chloe had never spoken so directly about seeing anything before. What did he look like? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Chloe hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her pajamas. He looked happy, she said finally, like he was remembering something really nice. The next morning, Laura noticed something new. One of the picture frames on the mantel, a photograph of Gene Kelly she had bought at an estate sale, was slightly crooked. When she straightened it, she noticed a faint smudge on the glass, as if someone had touched it. But it wasn't a fingerprint. It was the faint outline of a shoe print, perfectly positioned as if mid-step. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling as Chloe's words echoed in her mind. The house was silent, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. Just after midnight, the faintest sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a pair of shoes gently meeting the floor. She sat up, heart racing, and strained to listen. The tapping grew louder, more defined, carrying a pattern unmistakably like dancing. Unable to ignore it, she slipped out of bed and crept toward the living room, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The tapping stopped as she reached the doorway, leaving only the sound of her own breathing. The moonlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Then she saw it. In the middle of the room, a faint shimmer in the air twisted and moved. It wasn't a solid form, more like a ripple of light, swaying to a rhythm only it could hear. Slowly, it took shape. A figure, tall and elegant, spinning in a graceful arc. Laura's breath caught as she realized the figure's movements mirrored a style she'd seen countless times in old films. The figure paused mid-step, as if sensing her presence. Laura couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The shimmer turned slightly, and though it had no distinct face, Laura felt its attention fix on her. A whisper filled the air, so soft she wasn't sure if she heard it or felt it. "Do you hear the music?" The question sent a chill down her spine. But it wasn't fear she felt, it was something else. Something deeply nostalgic and profoundly sad. Before she could respond, the shimmer twirled once more, fading into the moonlight until the room was empty again. The next morning, Chloe was unusually quiet over breakfast. When Laura asked her what was wrong, Chloe frowned and toyed with her cereal. "He was sad last night," she said softly. Laura froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Chloe looked up at her, her young face serious. "The dancing man. He misses something. Or someone." The word sent a shiver through Laura, but before she could ask more, Chloe brightened suddenly, as if a new thought had occurred to her. "Maybe we can help him," she exclaimed. Laura didn't know how to respond. Could a lingering presence like this really need help? And if so, what could they possibly do for someone or something that had danced its way through a different lifetime? The answer came unexpectedly a few days later, when Laura found an old leather-bound notebook tucked inside the back of a dusty bookshelf. It was hidden behind a row of forgotten novels, its cover cracked and worn. Inside were pages filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and snippets of choreography. Scrawled on the first page in faded ink were the words, "To keep the dance alive." The notes seemed to pulse with energy, as though they had been waiting for someone to find them. But as Laura turned the pages, she noticed something odd. Certain phrases and drawings seemed unfinished, as if their creator had stopped mid-thought. And at the bottom of the final page, in handwriting that was shakier than the rest, a single question was written. "Will they remember me?" The words lingered in Laura's mind. Will they remember me? The question felt like a plea, a whisper that transcended time and space. She traced the shaky handwriting with her fingertip, the grooves faintly worn into the paper as if the writer had pressed the pen down in a moment of desperation. That evening, she sat in the living room with the notebook, the faint hum of Chloe's voice carrying from her room as she practiced her ballet. Laura flipped through the pages again, studying the incomplete choreography sketches. Each movement seemed deliberate, purposeful, yet abruptly halted. It was as though the dance had been interrupted before it could reach its final, triumphant moment. Curious, she placed the notebook on the coffee table and leaned back, staring at the space where she had seen the shimmering figure. "What do you want me to do?" she asked aloud, feeling a little foolish but unable to stop herself. The room remained still, the air heavy with silence. Then, ever so faintly, the record player in the corner clicked. Laura turned sharply. She hadn't used it in days. The arm lifted and placed itself on a vinyl record she didn't even recognize. A soft crackle filled the room, followed by the opening notes of a piano melody, one that sounded achingly familiar, but that she couldn't quite place. Her heart pounded as the music played. The same light, rhythmic tapping began again, matching the piano's tempo. This time, Laura didn't feel frozen in place. She stood slowly and moved toward the center of the room, drawn to the sound like a moth to a flame. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, as if something unseen was urging her to join in. Dance, Chloe's voice suddenly called from the hallway, startling Laura. She turned to see her daughter standing there, wide-eyed but smiling. "Mom, you have to dance with him." Laura blinked at her, unsure whether to laugh or protest. But the music swelled, the tapping growing more insistent, and she felt a strange pull. Slowly, tentatively, she began to move awkwardly at first, following the rhythm as best she could. She felt ridiculous, spinning alone in the empty room. But then something shifted. The air grew warmer, lighter, as though the room itself had come alive. Laura's movements became smoother, more natural, and she realized she wasn't dancing alone anymore. The shimmer was back, swirling around her, its movements graceful and effortless. It guided her, leading her into steps she didn't know she could take. Chloe clapped her hands and giggled from the doorway, but Laura barely noticed. She was lost in the dance, every step filling her with a strange, exhilarating sense of joy and longing. For a moment, it felt as though time stopped, the world reduced to the music and the dance. When the song ended, the shimmer paused in front of her. For the first time, Laura felt she could almost see a face's soft features, a kind smile, eyes brimming with gratitude. Then, like a breath of wind, it was gone. On the coffee table, the notebook lay open to a page she hadn't seen before. A new note was scrawled across the bottom in the same shaky handwriting. "The final step is yours." The words made Laura's stomach churn with equal parts dread and determination. What final step? And why did it feel like she was being asked to do something far more significant than a simple dance? Laura couldn't sleep that night. The note in the notebook played over and over in her mind. "The final step is yours." It sounded almost like a challenge or perhaps an invitation. But what did it mean? She felt as if the house itself was waiting for her to understand, its walls holding their breath in quiet anticipation. The next day, Laura began researching Gene Kelly's life more intently. She found old interviews, rare behind-the-scenes footage, and even stories from people who had worked with him. The more she read, the clearer it became. Gene Kelly's genius was not just in his choreography, but in his relentless pursuit of perfection. He had an unshakable desire to leave behind something timeless. But there was one detail that stood out. In the final years of his life, Kelly had been working on an unfinished dance project, a sequence he described as "the one I've been trying to perfect my entire career." It was rumored to be a masterpiece, but he never completed it. The details of the choreography were a mystery. No one knew if he'd written it down, recorded it, or abandoned it altogether. Laura's hands shook as she turned back to the notebook on her coffee table. The incomplete sketches, the cryptic notes, could this be the missing piece? Was she holding the remnants of Kelly's last, unfinished work? She decided to try something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. Pulling on an old pair of sneakers, Laura cleared the living room of furniture, leaving the floor bare. With the notebook open in front of her, she attempted to mimic the sketches. Each drawing depicted a movement, a step, a spin, a leap, but they didn't seem to connect. She felt clumsy and out of sync, as though she were missing something crucial. "Let the music guide you," Chloe said, standing in the doorway again, her voice eerily calm for an 8-year-old. Laura looked at her in surprise, but Chloe just smiled and walked away, leaving her mother alone in the room. Taking a deep breath, Laura placed the record back on the player and let the melody begin. This time, she didn't try to force the movements. Instead, She let herself flow with the music, trusting her instincts. The steps started to feel more natural, the rhythm syncing with something deep inside her. And then it happened. A gust of air swirled through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of rain on pavement and something else, something electric. The shimmer appeared again, stronger than before, its edges sharper, its movements more deliberate. It moved alongside her, and Laura realized with a start that the figure wasn't leading this time. It was following her. Her heart raced. Every step she took seemed to bring the shimmer closer to solid form, its outline growing clearer, its movements more fluid. For a brief, dizzying moment, Laura felt as if she and the figure were one, their movements merging into a seamless flow of motion and energy. And then she stumbled. The music stopped abruptly, the record scratching to silence. The shimmer vanished, leaving the room cold and still. Gasping for breath, Laura collapsed onto the floor, her pulse thundering in her ears. On the coffee table, the notebook had flipped to yet another page she hadn't noticed before. This one had no sketches, no choreography. Just 3 words scrawled in large, bold letters. Find the mirror. Laura frowned, confusion prickling at her. There were no mirrors in the house. She'd taken them all down after moving in, preferring the clean lines of bare walls. Why would the note mention a mirror? And where was she supposed to find it? As she stared at the words, she heard it again, that faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the room. But this time it wasn't just tapping. Beneath it, almost imperceptibly, she could hear the faint sound of humming, and it was coming from the wall. Laura's heart pounded as she stared at the wall where the sound emanated. It was the far corner of the living room, plain and unassuming, yet the tapping and faint humming seemed to pulse from within it. The air felt charged, heavy with something that had been waiting far too long to be discovered. Driven by a mix of curiosity and trepidation, Laura approached the wall. Her fingertips brushed over the smooth surface, searching for anything out of place. At first, she felt nothing but cool plaster. But then, at about chest height, her fingers caught the faintest ridge, a seam, so subtle it could easily be overlooked. Grabbing a flashlight, Laura examined the seam closely. It outlined a small, square panel, nearly invisible against the wall. She pressed on it, and with a soft click, the panel popped open. Inside was a shallow compartment, and within it lay an object wrapped in yellowed cloth. Laura carefully removed the bundle, unwrapping it to reveal a small, ornate hand mirror. The mirror was exquisite, with an intricate silver frame etched with swirling patterns that seemed to dance in the light. The glass was clear, almost unnaturally so, as if untouched by time. Yet as Laura stared into it, she felt an odd sense of vertigo, as though the mirror was deeper than it appeared, a window rather than a reflection. "Mom!" Chloe's voice broke the silence, startling Laura. The little girl was standing in the doorway again, her expression a mix of wonder and fear. "It's for him, isn't it?" Laura didn't know how to respond. She turned the mirror over in her hands, noticing an inscription etched into the back. To see the soul of the dance, one must step beyond the reflection. A shiver ran through her. The phrase felt like a riddle but also like a command. She glanced at Chloe, whose eyes were wide and unblinking, and then back at the mirror. Slowly, she lifted it to her face and gazed into the glass. At first, all she saw was her own reflection. But as she focused, the image began to ripple, as if the surface were water disturbed by a gentle breeze. Her reflection faded, replaced by a room that wasn't hers, an old studio, its wooden floors worn and scuffed from years of use. The figure of a man stood in the center, his back to her, his posture poised and graceful. "Jean?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. The man turned. It was Gene Kelly, or rather, a spectral version of him, translucent, yet vivid enough to make out every detail of his iconic smile. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He stepped closer, his movements smooth and deliberate, and gestured toward her, as if inviting her to join him. Without thinking, Laura reached out. Her hand passed through the glass, and suddenly, she felt herself pulled forward. The room shifted around her, the living room vanishing as she found herself standing on the studio floor, face to face with the legendary dancer. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm and rich, yet tinged with a profound sadness. "You've brought me back to where I belong." Laura opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Jean extended a hand. "Will you finish the dance with me?" he asked. Her heart caught in her throat, but she nodded. Together, they moved through the choreography, her steps guided by his presence. The music seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, swelling with a life of its own. Each movement felt like a conversation, a blending of two spirits across time. As they reached the final step, Jean stopped and turned to her. "This is where I leave," he said softly. "The last step is yours." Laura felt tears sting her eyes. "But why? You can stay. You can—" He shook his head, smiling gently. "The dance is complete now. You've made it whole." He took a step back, his form beginning to dissolve into the golden light that filled the studio. "Tell them my story," he said, "and never stop dancing." With that, he was gone. Laura blinked and found herself back in her living room, the mirror in her hand. The air felt lighter, the lingering presence of something unfinished now gone. Chloe ran to her, wrapping her arms around her waist. "You did it, Mom," she whispered. "You helped him." Laura held the mirror close, feeling its cool surface against her skin. The notebook on the coffee table was now closed, its pages blank. But Laura didn't need it anymore. The story, the dance, and Gene Kelly's legacy were etched into her heart. And from that day forward, Laura and Chloe danced every evening in the living room, keeping the spirit of the dance alive. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.